Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you all in the audience and folks who are watching online for this discussion about how is Congress doing evaluating the legislative branch. As I think most of you know, we at the Bipartisan Policy Center like to bring kind of a balanced approach to a lot of tough questions. And so a little good news and bad news to get us going. The good news is that according to the latest Gallup poll, Congress's job approval is as high as it has actually been in the last decade. The bad news is that 4 out of 5 people still think Congress isn't doing a very good job. And so, we can think about this as soaring over a low bar, but at least there's a little bit of upward momentum. I think the country, as you all know, has a proud bicameral and bipartisan history of disparaging the legislative branch. Our nation's founder, John Adams, stated, "I have accepted a seat in the House of Representatives and thereby consented to my own ruin." The founder of the Bipartisan Policy Center, Bob Dole, said, "If you're hanging around with nothing to do and the zoo is closed, come over to the Senate. You'll get the same kind of feeling and you won't have to pay." And I think while self-ridicule is actually one of the defining characteristics of a free democracy, unstudied and low expectations can also become self-fulfilling. So as we have a quaint affinity for evidence here at the BPC, several years ago we began an effort we call the Healthy Congress Index to try to track Congress's performance across a number of different metrics. We recognize that evaluating a complex and living institution is both science and art. And so we're really delighted to be joined today by colleagues from the Brookings Institute, Center for Effective Lawmaking, the Lugar Center, and the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, who are all working together to try to bring data to bear on this question of the health of our democracy. While our efforts, I will tell you, are rigorous, they are not purely academic. I think our intent, honoring the adage that you manage what you measure, is to try to create both impetus but also accountability for efforts at congressional reform. Very grateful to have Representative Derek Kilmer here today. I think you all know that he is serving as the chair of the new Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Looking forward very much to working with you in your office, as well as Vice Chair Graves and the rest of the committee, to try to help you create the tools and restore some of the traditions that are needed to to govern a divided country. And so finally, I want just to recognize 2 of the institutions that have been funding a lot of these collective efforts. This is the Hewlett Foundation. I see Daniel Stid and Jean Bordewick here with us, and the Democracy Fund with Sean Raymond and Chris Snells. I think these 2 organizations have actually really charted a course for a lot of groups to think about the process issues that affect our democracy. I think many, many people in this town want the Congress to work, and many, many people want somebody else to fix it. And so I think we are all here in a collective effort to try to do what we can. So with that, pleasure to turn over the program to BPC's Senior Vice President, Michelle Stockwell, for a conversation with someone who I believe is one of the most energetic, creative, and pragmatic members of the Congress, Representative Kilmer. So, Michelle, to you.
Thank you, Jason, for kicking off this morning's event. And welcome, Congressman Kilmer. We're pleased to have you here with us today. Just for a brief introduction, if folks who aren't as familiar with Congressman, he's represented the 6th District of Washington since 2012. You're also taken on some other significant roles this Congress, serving as chair of the New Democrat Coalition and as co-chair of the Bipartisan Working Group, which is bringing members from each side of the aisle to get together and work on shared interests. So you're clearly a busy guy, so we appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and welcome back to BPC. As Jason alluded to, we all know that Congress is at an historic low in public opinion, both in terms of public opinion and dysfunction, and members of Congress and their constituents are obviously frustrated with how things are working, or rather not working, on Capitol Hill. This year, the House, however, took a step forward towards changing that with creating a select committee on the modernization of Congress, which BPC and other organizations here today have all long called for, with the hopes of getting Congress effectively working again. Congressman, you're leading that committee along with Republican Representative Tom Graves from Georgia. For BBC, we see this as a unique opportunity to help address some of the issues that have been challenging Congress from fully fulfilling its role as the first branch of our government system. Congressman, What do you see as some of the fundamental challenges that are keeping Congress from being effective?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks everybody for being here, and for the organizations that are engaged on this subject. Thank you for that too. We're going to need as many oars in the water rowing to right the ship as we can. The committee was tasked with looking at 7 specific topic areas, and I actually think that they're largely focused on areas that are indeed problematic right now. Part of the reason Congress is not performing up to its capacity is because of some of the issues we've been explicitly assigned to look at. So, for example, we've been asked to look at rules and procedures. I give our Speaker and Chairman McGovern a lot of credit that at the beginning of this year, not only did they set up this committee, but they actually made some rules changes to try to broaden transparency, to try to make the process work a little bit better. But I think there's an appreciation for the fact that more needs to be done there. We've been asked to look at issues around technology. My colleague from Washington State, Kath McMorris-Rodgers, said Congress is a 19th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. I think that was pretty well put. Whether we're looking at how to use technology to engage our constituents, or whether we look at how to use technology and data to do better evidence-based policymaking, or even if we're just talking about issues around cybersecurity, right now Congress is not performing up to snuff. We've been asked to look at issues around administrative efficiencies. Right now you largely have 435 independent contractors, largely sort of doing their own thing. There's probably some opportunity there. Issues around calendar and schedule. Congress isn't here in Washington, D.C. all that much. Oftentimes the House is here, the Senate is not here, or vice versa. And so the capacity to actually just engage one another on problem solving is often, it's hard to do that when you're not here. Even issues around things like leadership development, franking. One of the big ones is staffing. So Congress over the years has largely been its own worst enemy. You've seen a significant downward trajectory in terms of institutional capacity. There's not a single position on personal office staffs or in a committee that has a median tenure of longer than 4 years. So you've just seen tremendous turnover, and in the absence of that institutional capacity, what has filled that void is lobbyists, and to some degree the executive branch. And I think that too makes it a lot harder to engage in a constructive way. So there's no dearth of stuff for us to look at. And there's no silver bullet to how to fix this, and I think that's why this committee is going to be really busy. And I'm really hopeful that we can get some good work done, and hopefully, as we look back at, hopefully in a couple of years, we'll say it's doing better.
This isn't the first time that Congress has set up a committee to try to tackle a significant problem. We've seen in recent years select committees set up jointly with the Senate to look at things from debt reduction to budget and appropriations process reform to pensions. Those unfortunately failed to achieve recommendations and see those recommendations enacted. How do you see this committee functioning differently, and how do you see working with your counterpart, Mr. Graves, to achieve success in the committee?
Yeah, that last piece I think is actually really important, in part because this committee is somewhat unique in that it's an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. Tom Graves is not my ranking member, he's my vice chair, right? Like we got a tag team on this stuff, and under the rules of the committee, to make a recommendation, we need to have a 2/3 vote. And so having this happen together, having this work be bipartisan is going to be really critical. What that means is trying to get buy-in on the front end and trying to work in a collaborative way with the members of the committee. This is not something where Derek Kilmer, or frankly any other member of this committee, can try to just sort of call the shot on their own. So we're going to have a collaborative process. I think the other thing that I sort of took away from some of the last select committees, and I was on the Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform, which, among other things, needed a shorter name. But I was on that, and we were actually really close to getting some good work done. I think one of the lessons I took away from that effort was I think the way we're looking at this Select Committee is to try to push recommendations out as we go. We have a year. We've been assigned the task of fixing Congress in a year. Please pray for me. But beyond, I think it would be a mistake for us to say, you know, a year from now present our report and expect things to improve. My intent is to have us push out recommendations as we go. If we have a, you know, discussion on staffing issues and we have members converge around some ideas, to push out those recommendations, maybe even put them into bill form and try to get them cooking. If we have ideas around technology or around shared services or whatever, not to wait, but to just start pushing those ideas out and hopefully avoid having the plane fly into the side of the mountain.
Are there certain areas where you see clear opportunity for bipartisan agreement on fixing the institution?
You know, I don't think we've been assigned anything that you say, well, that's just clearly a Democratic issue or clearly a Republican issue. I've been very interested by the members that have engaged me since this committee's been established, who've, you know, and it's been folks from both sides of the aisle who've said, you know, hey, I've got, you know, I've got an idea here, I've got an idea there, and it hasn't really, I can't sort of, much as our country is polarized and much as Congress is polarized, I have not seen that polarization yet infiltrate the subject areas we've been tasked with looking at.
You mentioned the year time frame, and as you allude to, also the scope of the committee, and a year is really not a whole lot of time to overhaul an institution that hasn't been retooled in decades. What do you see as issues that might require more time and live beyond the duration of the committee? And you know, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the committee is only one piece of this equation. There are other relevant committees that would need to act on any recommendations, and obviously Republican and Democratic leadership will be important to embracing and moving things forward. How do you see that process supporting the work of the committee, particularly when it comes to more challenging recommendations?
Sure. Well, I think it's important. I think you're right that and I look at this as a good news thing. The good news is there are already committees that are engaging on some of the stuff that we've been assigned to look at. Part of the reason that there's someone from both sides of the aisle on the Rules Committee assigned to this committee is because Rules has already looked at some rules reforms. In fact, at the beginning of the year, we passed some rules reforms. And so that's something that I think we'll continue to iterate on. Similarly, House admin, you know, Zoe Lofgren's on the committee, Rodney Davis is on the committee. They have already looked at some of the issues, whether it be around staffing or whether it be around, and they set up a committee like this. One of the takeaways, so we asked the Congressional Institute to share with us what were lessons learned from past exercises. And one of the lessons learned was, more often than not, the recommendations are not enacted in the same year that the committee was established. And so we may have to look at, okay, well, what does the next year's ledge branch appropriations process look like? Or, you know, are there some things that are going to require further, you know, further legislative effort in House admin or whatever? So to me, what's important is that we just build momentum for change. I mean, I haven't been in Congress all that long. This is my 4th term. And it's, you know, it's, for all of the jokes that Jason told, right? It's weird being in an organization that is less popular than colonoscopies and Nickelback, right? Like, sorry to any Nickelback fans. Liberation in the legislative branch looks like an episode of the Jerry Springer Show. Congress is earning that low approval rating, and making progress on fixing that is not going to be, there's not just a lever we can pull, but we got to pull as many levers as we can to make progress.
Some of the stuff you mentioned, whether it be, you know, administration of offices and staffing, and clearly this isn't sexy stuff to talk about back home. How do you, and how do we as a community that's interested in trying to improve the system generate more public support for some of these changes, particularly when it comes to some changes that might require more investing of resources in the legislative branch?
That's that's a fair question. I think, one, there is an appreciation by the American public that this isn't working, right? The slide that was up on your screen before we started was sort of evaluating congressional performance or something like that, and I think we've seen the grade, and I think the American public certainly has an appetite for fixing that. To your point, there may be some areas where the most popular thing for Congress to do is self-flagellate, right? Is to actually continue to self-flagellate. The consequence of that, you know, and we saw that during the 90s where Congress cut its own staffing by a third. The consequence of that is that vacuum has been filled by lobbyists. And I think the American public absolutely understands that in the absence of Congress having the capacity to serve the public interest, you will see special interests served instead. So my sense is that there will be some appetite within the American public to deal with this. You are right, you know, digging into the nitty-gritty of rules reform and congressional calendars and technology and some of these issues, you're right, that's not sort of a sexy topic. But having the organization simply function, I think the American people want that, and I think they want it a lot. So making sure that as we make recommendations, we're having a clear connection to, and here's how, you know, here's the problem statement, here's why this proposal could actually fix it and how it will improve institutional performance. That's the burden all of us need to deliver on over the next year.
Okay. So I have to ask, just because it's been obviously such a hot topic recent weeks, with regard to the motion to recommit, which folks know is a motion reserved for the minority in the House to do an amendment to legislation. Do you see that as a topic that the committee will look at? And what is your sense on the need for either a different structure or more or less input of the minority into the legislative process in the House?
Yeah. Let me answer that in a couple ways. One, we've been asked to look at rules and potential rules reforms. So in that the MTR is part of the rules, it's not off the table. It's not, you know, I don't know that we've had an explicit conversation as a committee about it yet. I have a personal perspective, which is that it doesn't contribute either to transparency or to the comity of the organization. It's basically a means through which the minority can do a gotcha on the majority and use it in campaign ads. And I say that without, you'll notice I didn't reference either party in that because both parties do it. And when I was in the minority, my perspective was, this is stupid, we should do away with this. But, and I continue to think that. In that, if you really want to engage the minority in the legislative process, then you should figure out rules that actually engage the minority in the legislative process, not just create some avenue through which you can throw up, literally with less than 5 minutes notice, some sort of gotcha amendment that is solely to be used in a political ad. I think this is why the American people hate Congress, right? Like, this is the type of thing that, you know, and I don't know if folks have followed this. I mean, what we're talking about is, you know, so there was a bill to provide, for example, a pay increase to federal workers who hadn't had one in quite some time. And the motion to recommit that was released literally, you know, a couple minutes before it was debated on the floor and then voted on, for example, said something like, but no pay increases for people who've been accused of sexual misconduct or something like that. And you're in this, you know, bonkers world of, well, there's not a single member of Congress who is, you know, out there campaigning on pay increases for people who've had sexual misconduct, you know. No kidding, right? So it's solely a gotcha, right? Everyone, I could go through every MTR that we've had this year. Every one of them has solely been so that this can be used in a political context. So I think it's a legitimate issue for folks to be talking about. I don't know, and again, one of the values of this committee is anything we deal with has to be done in a bipartisan way. To make a recommendation, our committee has to have 2/3 vote. So what that suggests is if we're going to look at it, it has to be done in a way that respects the minority, that actually gives a legitimate role for the minority to actively engage in the legislative process. And I don't know is the short answer of whether I've already missed the short answer window there. Sorry about that, guys. But I don't know if there's a common ground to be had on that, but we'll see.
Great. You served in the state legislature. Some might say that states are a better place to engage on policy making these days than the federal level. What are the lessons learned from your experience that the committee could look at, or other states that are doing things?
Well, I think that's one of the things we intend to do. I mean, Congress is a longstanding legislative body. It's not the only longstanding legislative body. There are state legislatures that I think that could provide some best practices for us to look at, frankly, on any number of these issues, and even on little things. I was talking with one of the senators from my state, and we were talking about, we had both served in the state legislature back in Washington State. When we voted on things in Washington State, you literally had the document in front of you, and where you were changing legislative text, you'd be able to look at what was being changed, right? There was actually, you could sit there with your computer and say, this is being struck out and this is being added. And that doesn't sound like rocket science, but we don't do that here, right? Like, that is just one example of transparency that seems to be lacking. And I'm not entirely sure why. We've heard, I had a member pull me aside and do in our state, when we dealt with issues around, each office had a budget, basically the equivalent of MRA, which every congressional office has here. But there were some things that were shared, right? There were some things that you said, well, this is just going to be sort of a cost that everybody bears. So looking at some of those sorts of things, I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at best practices from the states, and we intend to lean on everyone from the Council of State Governments to the National Conference of State Legislatures and others toward that end.
Great, thank you. We have some time for some questions, so why don't we open it up to the audience? I think there's probably some mics being passed around, and if you could please identify yourself when asking a question. No questions from anybody?
I just covered it all.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure talking with you. And on behalf of PPC and a number of the other organizations in the room today, we really look forward to working both with you and the rest of the members on the Select Committee and restoring a more functional Congress. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
You bet.
And we've got Muftia and Dave. Is that right? I think they're there. I don't know. They lined us up this way for some scientific reason. So. Good morning. We're going to try to move this along with keeping you from getting breaks for this this topic. We're thankful for having you all here today. Thankful for Representative Kilmer coming to join us. I'm John Fortier of the Bipartisan Policy Center. I think what we're going to see here over the next two panels, really the core of this event, which is a number of institutions who are really measuring Congress in a variety of different ways. trying to figure out the health of Congress, trying to give Congress some benchmarks by which we might judge them and which change might be affected because of this. We've broken this into a couple of panels because we have a number of institutions. We have a couple of institutions, the Brookings Institution and Bipartisan Policy Center on this panel. And then we have a second panel with the Lugar Center, the Center for Legislative Effectiveness, and the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies on the second panel. So let me introduce our panel. So we'll begin with a couple of presentations from the institutions that have indices that measure Congress. We'll also have some comments from our super commentators, who I'll introduce in a second. And then we'll have time for a little discussion and also audience questions. So let me begin at the end with Michael Thorning, who is a senior policy analyst here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He is the person who was really crunching the numbers and making our Healthy Congress Index work. You'll hear more about the Healthy Congress Index, but it's one that we have put together to really measure congressional procedure, how coming out of a commission we did a number of years ago on political reform. Michael also has experience on Capitol Hill, working especially the New Mexico delegation. Molly Reynolds, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She is has a PhD from the University of Michigan. She's also the author of a book which has been very relevant in recent years, Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate. She is also the editor of Vital Statistics on Congress. This is an institution in Washington which is about to turn almost 40 years old, yes? And Molly has been not editing it for that long, I promise you that, but has been involved with it even before recently for quite a while. I sometimes like to wave books around, but I find that I have Molly's first book on my Kindle, and Vital Statistics is no longer a physical book, but you can find all of the stats and data on the Brookings Institution website. So I mentioned we're going to hear from these two indices, and then we have two commentators who have a wealth of experience on Capitol Hill. I'll start with Dave Hoppe, who's the senior principal at 38 North Solutions. He has spent over 30 years on the Hill working for Paul Ryan, Trent Lott, Jack Kemp, Dan Coates, John Kyle, and relevant to this, people who are partisans of the House or the Senate, Dave Hoppe is the only person who's been chief of staff to both a Speaker of the House and a Senate Majority Leader. So we're glad for him to join us today. And then here to my left is Muftia McCartin, who is the co-director of public policy at Covington. And she has served in the House of Representatives on the Rules, Appropriations, and in the Parliamentarian's Office. So again, we will begin with our indices. Let me start here at home with the Bipartisan Policy Center and our Healthy Congress Index. Michael, both can you lay out a little bit what it is we're trying to get at with this index, and also, since we have results from the most recent Congress, what are the big takeaways for how Congress is doing in this index?
Thank you, John. So I'll hold something up since you don't have any books. We're releasing today this report, How Congress Governed in a Polarized Era, taking our data looking from 2007 to 2018. So the 110th Congress through the end of the last Congress, the 115th. And let me also just say, I see him. He's here in the audience, Don Wolfensberger. The Healthy Congress Index would not be possible without his work with us here, and I thank him for all of his help. So our index, we created as a way to try to measure a couple of things. One, just really plainly, how often is Congress here in Washington doing work? Sometimes, we all know that Congress does not spend full work weeks here in Washington. Sometimes it's 2 days, sometimes it's 3. Every once in a while it's 4. Pretty rarely it's 5. So we look at that, and then we look at a bunch of measures of regular order, what we've identified as regular order. So are members able to offer amendments on the floor when a bill comes up? How robust is debate, particularly in the Senate, looking at the filibuster and cloture? And we also look at the committee process, our committees reporting bills. And finally, which has not gotten a lot of use in recent years, but we look at conference committees over time and see how often Congress has relied on that to kind of shore up the differences between House and Senate legislation. we'll just start right in with some of the trends. You know, we know on working days, Congress has pretty much spent a somewhat stable number of working days in Washington, but it's pretty short of a 5-day work week. And in the case of the House, it doesn't even really add up to a 4-day work week. You know, you do get some days where the House and Senate come in, and they sort of do these pro forma sessions. The Senate's a little better at cheating at it. They come in, you know, and they kind of do a couple of things, and they're in for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and then, you know, they gavel out. We don't count those days. We don't think those are real working days in Washington. The House tends to be in for about 3 minutes on these kind of pro forma days. They don't do anything, and then they gavel out. And so we don't count those days either. So, you know, I think for the House, in this period, they spent on average 245 days in Washington in a 2-year period. We would expect them, if they were working 5-day work weeks, 3 weeks in Washington, 1 week doing district or state work periods, we'd expect them to be around 330 days in a 2-year period. So almost 100 days beneath where they should be. The Senate's a little better. They kind of tend to be somewhere around 300 days. In a few recent years, they've gotten a little closer, around 320 days. You know, somewhat that might be reflective. You know, it takes a little longer to get things done in the Senate. You know, the House can move pretty quickly. The Senate's a little slower body. You know, so other than working days, kind of get into our regular order stuff. You know, the committees. Committees have actually been very active in recent years. We've seen this upward trend in the last 2 Congresses. Committees just churning out more bills. Now, what happens to those bills? Do they make it to the floor? Or are those the bills that end up getting voted on? We don't look at that yet, but you know, we know the committees are active and they're doing their work, which is what we want them to do. In the case of the House, looking at the floor, you know, do members have an opportunity to really participate in the process once it gets there? We find the House has really just moved to a restrictive amendment process. And this is, as Don Wolfensberger's work has shown for a while, this has been going on longer than our index accounts for. You know, we see, I'm going to pull out my little cheat sheet here, but last Congress, 115th Congress, there were no bills on the floor where any member could offer an amendment. And more than half of the bills that came to the floor, no one could offer any amendments. That's, for us, we don't think that's a healthy legislative process. You know, that tells us that you know, the bills are being written probably by leadership in most cases, with some input from the committees. It comes to the floor, and the members are just being told, okay, this is your choice, vote on this bill. Moving over to the Senate, we've seen, you know, it's a little different situation over there, you know, where it's used to a very open amendment process, but in recent years, I mean, really, you know, last Congress, I think only it was the second lowest number of amendments the Senate considered in recent history. You know, we saw this bump up when Mitch McConnell came in the 114th Congress. Suddenly we got a lot more amendments on the floor, and then it cut down almost by half after that. So the Senate's not really considering a lot of amendments, which again tells us members aren't getting an opportunity to put their ideas out there to really represent their constituents. And you know, so we would expect them to start considering more amendments to have a better floor process. And then it comes down to what everyone's always talking about, especially now in terms of nominations, which is the filibuster in the Senate. We don't look at nominations in our measure. We're just looking at filibuster on legislation. And last Congress, it really was not much of a problem at all. And Molly can get into more of why that was, but there were really very few on legislation last Congress. Where the Congress before that, you had about 120 in the 114th Congress, which would have been the end of President Obama's term. 115th Congress, just 40, from 120 to 40. So has been a lot of variation, but you know, we've seen, and we'll see how that continues in this Congress, and Molly can probably talk about why these trends are happening, but most of the focus has been on nominations in the Senate when it comes to the filibuster. And then the last thing I'll just say is on conference committees, which have really not been getting full use in recent years. So 110th and 111th Congress, you had 14 conference committees, 13 conference committees where those reports were adopted. So that's 110th, 111th, and you go from about somewhere around 7 or 5 conference committees per Congress since then. It's really almost cut down by half or more than half in some cases. But what I think we know, about committees, and certainly Dave and Muftiya can kind of get into this. Conference committee is really where you can kind of hash out an agreement that can get a bill passed. And I think we saw that with the last appropriations bill where we had the government shutdown. They turned the deal making over to a conference committee, and that's eventually where the deal got cut. So that's sort of a broad overview for us of how regular order is doing in the House and Senate. And I guess the top line is it's not very good. There's a lot of room for improvement, and so we're hopeful about the future and promises from leadership to make changes.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Molly and just remind you, Vital Stats has a breadth of, it covers a lot of ground and has for quite a long time. So I know you're going to focus on a few things.
Yeah.
So that and then also you have a long track record of data over many years, but also just some thoughts about how Congress has been doing recently.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Thank you for having me. So as John said, Vital Statistics on Congress in 2 years, in 2021, will turn 40 years old, which is pretty remarkable. It is a really rich data source that is the result of a lot of hard work by a lot of people. I supervise its production now, but I couldn't do the work that I do to put that data out in the world without my team. So we have some new data out this morning, and that's what I'm going to focus on. But I do want to sort of acknowledge them and generations of both Brookings and American Enterprise Institute research assistants and interns who have worked on the project. So the way that I really see Vital Statistics on Congress is providing a really wide range. We have about 100 time series that we've tracked over time, of providing kind of the raw material that folks like Michael and folks at BPC and all of you in the kind of congressional reform, congressional scholarship community need to do the work that you do. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of the things that Vital Stats can and does do, particularly thinking about the new data that we've released this morning on the 115th Congress and the new members in the 116th Congress. So one thing that we do with Vital Stats is it can tell us about what the current Congress looks like demographically, especially in comparison to recent history. So we know, for example, that the new Congress, the 116th Congress, has a record number of African Americans, of Asian Americans, of Hispanic Americans, and of women. The number of women in Congress has basically doubled in the past 20 years. This matters for what Congress works on. We know from political science research that members tend to be more active on issues that are important to the demographic groups they represent, though that's not independent of partisan considerations. We also know from the data that we have that this growth in the diversity of Congress isn't even across parties. I think that's important to note, and it's one thing we dig into in the data. The growth in, especially in women, but also in racial minorities, has been carried more heavily by Democrats. That's one thing that our data demonstrates. Another thing we see for this new Congress is a small decline in the average service of members in the new Congress. This isn't surprising. We have this very large new class of freshman Democrats in the House with the change in party control. But knowing that members on average are a little bit less experienced in this Congress than they were in the last Congress, reminds us that for new members being in Congress, there's a learning curve. Representative Kilmer was talking about the motion to recommit. You've seen some reports in the press about freshmen who are, what is this? What is this thing where one party can come to the floor 10 minutes before a vote and unleash this amendment? There are all kinds of things about how the institution works that new members need to learn. And so we know from our data that there's a little bit more of that happening now because of this lower average terms of service. There's also, our data also gives us the ability to sort of dig into some things that we see reported in the press and kind of figure out, is this conventional wisdom? Is this trend that folks are talking about? Is it really reflected in the data? And so one just sort of interesting piece on this is during the 2018 midterm campaign, we heard a lot of reporting about the number of veterans running for Congress. And if we look at the number of House freshmen who are veterans this year versus the last Congress, it's about the same. It's about 20% of the freshman class are veterans. So in the 116th, that's about the same as what the 115th was. But interestingly, that set of veterans is a little bit more skewed towards Democrats in the new Congress than it was in the last Congress. So again, that's the sort of thing that our data can help us talk about. I'm just going to talk a little bit about another thing that our data can do, which is tell us a little bit about what Congress has been up to. So Michael talked about this from a kind of regular order perspective. Our data really speaks a lot to just productivity. So Michael was talking about committees. One thing we track is the number of hearings that committees have in the House and the Senate. We saw that in the House, the number of committee hearings was down slightly in the last Congress. But we also, looking back at the long sweep of history in our data, see that in the last two times, the majority in the House changed hands. So between 2006 and 2007, and then again between 2010 and 2011. That first Congress, after a majority change, we saw a big increase in the number of hearings. If the opening weeks of the 116th are any indication, I expect that when we release more data this time next year, we'll see that trend as well. The Senate, meanwhile, in the hearings, the number of hearings has been pretty consistent since 2011 with sort of a slight growth over that window since 2011, though prior to that, between 2007 and 2010, the numbers were higher. And then the last thing that I'll speak about briefly, because Michael brought it up, this question of the use of the filibuster and cloture motions, which is another thing that we track in our data. And so one thing that our data can do is it can sort of tip you off to a potentially interesting outlier in the data, and then when you dig into it, you get kind of a more interesting answer about what's really going on. So one of the things that you see if you look at, and we do track sort of all cloture votes on both nominations and legislation. So if you look at the 115th Congress, especially the first session in the Senate, you see a very high ratio of successful cloture votes to all cloture votes. So a very high number of the cloture votes that were being attempted were ultimately successful. And so you see this trend and you ask yourself, well, why might that be true? So one explanation would be, oh, the Senate is doing a lot of stuff that's really bipartisan. That's getting a number of members from the minority party to go along with members of the majority party. But when you dig into what's underlying that data, you find out that that's in fact not what was happening, that really what was driving that very high ratio of successful cloture votes to all cloture votes is the fact that so many of those votes were on nominations, and that since 2013 for lower court judges and for executive branch officials, and then obviously since early 2017 for the Supreme Court, cloture votes on nominations have only required 51 votes instead of 60. And then we also, as Michael was alluding to, saw, especially in the first session of the 115th Congress, the Senate spending a lot of time on things that also did not need 60 votes to invoke cloture, like resolutions under the Congressional Review Act and budget reconciliation bills. So again, one of the things that the data can and does do is sort of give us a sense of, well, sort of point us in the direction of potentially interesting findings that then can lead to more substantive conversations. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to John.
Great. So I'd love to hear from Dave and Muftia your thoughts, maybe putting a few things on the table. We have some thoughts about schedule and how much Congress is working here and how that's working. Some about process, and especially the openness of the process for debate. And if you want to talk about the motion to recommit, which we talked about earlier, I think that's on the table as well. We don't measure that. We measure, assuming that's there, and then measure other sorts of amendments allowed. Certainly the composition of Congress, and then committees, how committees are functioning. So that's just a few things to put on the table, but well, we'll start with Muftiya, and then we'll go to Dave.
So I would like to start off, because I think it's important to put all of this in kind of like an overall context, which is that, you know, if you look at the way the rules of the House and the Senate have developed over the last 200 years, the Senate has moved towards the primacy of the defense, and the House has moved towards the primacy of the offense. The House has become a very majoritarian body, and it wasn't always like that. And there were a lot of opportunities for any member to trip up the procedures in order to leverage policy. And as the House developed over the years, over the rules, those were closed off. When it became more and more majoritarian, more and more efficiency, the Rules Committee was, you know, basically grew out of both changes to the rules and also just precedents to have this sort of extraordinary authority. And on the Senate, the thing that's interesting about your vital statistics is I think that just the number of cloture votes, whether they're successful or not, to me doesn't matter. The number of cloture votes basically means that there hasn't been this self-discipline among the senators, so you've had to force cloture votes, and that just again is showing how the primacy of the defense has actually grown in the Senate, where you can get single members trying to, you know, basically pushing these cloture votes. And so in, you know, for example, just as an example, the motion to recommit, and I do commend everyone to read Don's paper on this, Don Wolfensberger's paper on this, because, you know, the motion to recommit is if you look at it in the course of the last almost 200 years, you'll see that it is one of the few minority rights that are left. There are very few. In my mind, there's really just two important ones. There's this one, and then the minority right to call witnesses. And in terms of just being the most effective minority rights that are left. So it's tricky. So I actually agree with Mr. Kilmer that you know, it has turned into more of a gotcha, and they're not substantive and they're political. And gosh, it sure would be great to, you know, to find a way to you know, thread the needle there. But it's tricky because you have to look at it in the historical context. And so I think when we're talking about the effectiveness of Congress, I think it's important to just kind of look at it in the historical context.
Thank you. The publications that are put out are very useful and very helpful in providing a great number of statistics. My grave concern about what's going on in Congress is looking at the 21st century. If you look at the executive branch of the government, they're doing quite well defending the power of the president and the growth of the power of the executive branch. If you look at the judicial branch of the government, they also seem to be doing quite well in the 21st century. However, if you look at the legislative branch, Article 1, they aren't doing very well, in my opinion. And if we are going to have a country that functions the way the founders meant it to function, they set up a government which they thought the legislative branch would be the most powerful, influential, and important part of the government. Instead, it's becoming the least. Now, some of that is because the executive tries to pull this power away, or the judicial branch makes decisions that pull some of the power away from Congress. But a lot of it is Congress is giving it away. Every time Congress does a continuing resolution, every time they do an omnibus, their most important power, the power of the purse, is being frittered away. Because only in the case of an omnibus, only a rare group, a rarefied group of members even get to participate in those decisions. Yeah, they've talked to their colleagues as they put the bill together in the Appropriations Subcommittee, but only that very rarefied group gets to be participants in that. And if you do a continuing resolution, you're giving it away altogether. And Congress has done this for a number of reasons. But Congress has to look at itself, in my opinion, very carefully and start to pull back where it has given away power, and in some cases is going to have to challenge both the executive branch and the courts. Because if we have a Congress that is the weakest branch of our government, I think we're giving away part of the miracle of the Founding Fathers and the system they set up. Let me just spend a moment so I can scare all the Rules Committee staffers. I think it's easy to solve the problem of getting rid of the motion to recommit. And what you do is you make the Rules Committee an even committee with however many Democrats, however many Republicans. Nobody gets a majority on that, and you have to have at least one person from the minority party. You have to have a bipartisan vote to report out a rule. You'd have a lot more amendments that would be allowed if the members of the Rules Committee were free to make these decisions. Now, I can't imagine a leadership wanting to do that, especially in the modern day, where 9-4 Rules Committees, or what is it, 11 to 5 Rules Committees. Make sure you have 2 to 1 plus 1, because you don't want to lose. Somebody gets goes out crazy on your Rules Committee who you've carefully picked to do exactly what the leadership wants. But part of the reason you end up with motions to recommit the way they are is it's the last chance they're going to get to offer an amendment. Oh my God, we've got to figure out something really clever. Whereas if you allow people the process of amending things in regular order and often, you're going to find that people are going to be more engaged and working more together. I think one of the reasons we've lost some of the bipartisanship is we don't have real regular order in subcommittees and committees and reporting bills. Most of the major bills end up with the leadership and a small group of other members sitting down, and they may have taken something that came through the committee process, but then they change it in the way they want it to be, so it just sets up perfectly for them. It's a lousy way of getting members involved. And members never get to have this fight in subcommittee, and where they talk and they figure out, wait a minute, if I change my amendment a little bit, I may be able to get a bipartisan majority here and get this added to the bill. You don't see that very much anymore in Congress. And that part of regular order, or that definition of regular order, we all have our own, I know. Everybody here has their regular order, and I have mine. But if you would have more of that going on, I think you would have members working together. The final thing I'll say, and I'll stop, is if that gave me one wish of what I would change, I'd get rid of the voting machines in the House. I came in the mid-'70s, just before they started voting machines. And it used to be sort of fun to watch a vote in the House, because they read through the whole list and they didn't go back. So you'd come to the floor and you missed your name by 3. So you sat there for 15, 20 minutes and to wait for your name to come around again. You know what they did when they sat there for 15 or 20 minutes? They talked. They actually interacted with each other. Watch a vote on the floor now. Watch how many people run in quickly off the elevator, stick that thing in, and then run off. And this is where they're having a series of votes. And some of them stick around and talk to each other on either side of the aisle and stick to either side of the aisle. But a lot of this is, we have lost the communication between people. And I think the congressional schedule has that, the fact that members don't spend as much time in Washington, their families don't spend any time in Washington effectively, compared to at least a generation ago. I think those things have lost part of the building of a sense of respect for people you may disagree with on substance, but find are good, decent people you can work with. On both sides of the aisle, I think this has happened. Stop.
And you touched on the schedule, and maybe if some of you also want to talk a little bit about just the balance of time between home and D.C. And committees. Is anything to be said? I do think we both in our measure committees in a good way about the number of bills they report, the number of hearings they hear, but the actual sort of reinvigorating committees and their relation to leadership, it's a little hard to get to with data, but maybe somebody wants to say a little something about committees and schedule. Yeah.
So let me just start with the schedule. So I too came in the mid-'70s, and so when O'Neill came in, he was the one who really tried to impose a more family-friendly, district-friendly schedule, and he also tried to protect time for the committees. And it was pretty limited. We were still doing 4 or 5 days a week then. When I became a staffer in Congress, there were 14 women. There were 14 women in Congress, 14 women in the House. I think maybe 14 women in the entire Congress. And So as each speaker has come in, where you have younger members, you have younger families, you have more women, you had pressure on the leadership, not just to balance the district business, not to mention, you know, the political work that members now have to do. You really had these families. It wasn't the kind of situation anymore where the men can just come here and stay all week in their apartments with their, with their colleagues and, kind of hang out and it, the bad part of that is just as Dave was saying, you didn't have those friendships develop those friendships were just really solid back in the 70s and 80s. So I'll just tell one really quick anecdote about this. So after 9/11, we had a group of women legislators from the Middle East come, and they sat on the floor, and several of us talked to them. And I guess back in the 90s, so this would have been after the year of the women, so I'm not sure how many women we were up to. I don't know, maybe 30 or something. But so they got up and they were like, well, I don't understand why there's so few women in Congress. And so I tried to explain, the country is 3,000 miles. It's not like it's not like we're prohibiting women because we're institutionally prohibiting women. It's because it's just practical. I mean, we had the Zoe Lofgrens and the Ross Leightonens. We had women who were raising their families, but it was many women were coming after their families were raised. And so this is, trying to accommodate these families and trying to accommodate women coming here with small children from California. You've got to have that flexibility. So I think that the schedule is tricky. Again, it's like the motion to recommit. It's tricky. It's not so, oh, we just have to be here 5 days a week. I mean, we can all talk about how bad it is for the legislative process that they're not here. But there's so many other kind of things to balance. And just one other thing I want to say in committees. I think judiciary, let's look at judiciary last year. This is a perfect example. Judiciary is the most ideological committee with the most ideological members on both sides of the aisle. Do you know how much bipartisan stuff they got done last year? Last Congress, the Modernization Act, the Cloud Act. I'm forgetting another one of the tech bill. Oh, the Music Modernization Act, the Cloud Act, and I'm forgetting. Criminal justice reform. Those are bipartisan measures. So you take the ideology out, and you just get members working on stuff. You get bipartisanship. You get amendments. You get things happening. And I'm sorry, I said lastly, but I actually have one more thing to say. On the Rules Committee, there was a trend towards the presumption was the amendment will not be made in order, either side of the aisle, unless you can prove to me that it should be made in order. That has to shift, and McGovern has, I think Jim McGovern has committed to shifting that burden. So show me that this amendment cannot be made in order. It's not germane, it violates the Budget Act, it's just so politically toxic, we can't touch it. And I think, we only have a few weeks, right? And the first few weeks were, messed up with the appropriations process being broken this year for its own reasons. But I think you're kind of seeing that shift, and hopefully it will shift. To your point, I don't think we can go to a bipartisan committee, but I think we can go to a shifting of the burden. So the burden is on those who don't want to make the amendment in order. Not the burden shouldn't be on those who want to make the amendment in order.
All right, let me open it up to the audience here. We have some microphones that come around. You can identify yourself. I think we've got a microphone. All right, we'll go without the microphone. Why don't we start here?
I guess I'll stand up since there isn't a microphone. Can you guys hear me okay? No projecting. All right. So first of all, Mufti, I really enjoyed your comments in particular, and this is sort of a question for all of you. There are things that you're able to measure now. Like the vital statistics does a phenomenal job of looking back over 38, 39 years in terms of sort of what's happened. But there's a lot of things that are kind of difficult to measure. Amendments that are accepted in the committee process, for example, as part of the way things sort of just work their way through that you wouldn't be able to see. So my question for the two folks sort of towards the left is, what should we be measuring? And for the two folks on the right, what are you having a really hard time finding to go and be able to generate the data to actually measure?
I think the things you want to look at measuring, many of them are here, but I would also say that we want to look at that process and where it's interrupted. I talked earlier about the fact that some committees will bring a bill, but then that bill that is brought to the floor doesn't look very much like that which the committees reported or had worked on. It's easy to lose a lot of interest and lose a lot of excitement in getting things done and working through the process if that's going to be the result. So I think you have to look at sort of, if you will, the political action that occurs as bills go through the process. The statistics are very helpful, but in the end, you have to look at the political side. And the second thing is you really have to look at how members work together. One of the things I did, being an old guy who worked on the Hill a long time, is would give talks to groups of students or business people or those who bring people from different departments up. And I always used to say in that you have to understand Congress, you have to understand it's a very human institution. In the end, the human relationships will determine most of the key things. I can't say that anymore. I really don't think it's not all gone, but it's too often not the case. And losing that has lost a lot. And that's something I don't think, it's pretty hard to measure statistically, but you can see it and feel it. And that's something that we have to figure out a way of getting back to, people being able to deal on a human level with each other.
And Dave started off his comments last time talking about how Congress has given up so much of its legislative authority. If that could be measured, I mean, that is such a danger to democracy. I mean, our sausage making may be ugly, but it is our heartblood. And if that could somehow be measured, because it's frightening how much authority is being given away.
Holly, Michael, you want to say anything about what we're lacking?
A couple of, I think Dave and Mufti got at really good points, and I agree with both of them. And especially, it's so hard to figure out how you measure, right? Basically, what we're talking about is leadership intervention in the regular process, right? When leadership sort of, decides that they have negotiated or come up with the right version of the bill that is what the members are going to vote on. It's a hard thing to get at, and don't yet know that we know what data we would even need exactly to get at that. But one thing that's also really important, and hasn't come up directly here, is whether Congress is doing its oversight work, not the kind of oversight work we've seen in the last couple of weeks where we're talking about bringing administration officials up before Congress and asking them what are both tough but also very politically charged questions about wrongdoing, waste, fraud, and abuse, or whether people have broken the law. But oversight work looking at government programs, agencies, departments, authorizations. I think I've lost track at this point of how long it's been since the Department of Justice has been reauthorized, but that authorization is long expired. The State Department authorization is long expired. I mean, these are probably the two of the most important functions of our government, and Congress has not done its work to review what's going on in these departments and decide if they want it to continue that way. Do they want to make changes? I'm sure the Department of Justice is like more than 40 years, so I'm sure there are some changes that could be made. There's not a lot of good data out there, an easy way to get that data. Some people, I know Craig Bolden is here, and I know he's done a little bit of work on this, but I think he'd probably agree that it's also a hard thing to do in a simple way. And that might be something Congress could help us with themselves, is trying to put that kind of data out. So I think that's a really important thing. And also, I think to both of these points, it's hard to measure relationships. And some of what we need more of, you can't do this with data so well. There's not a lot of qualitative research about Congress in terms of people, regularly kind of interviewing members outside of what you get in the press and the media, which is valuable. But I think it could be good if we had more people. The R Street Institute and Issue 1 put out a great report with members of Congress who just left. It was called something, I think, like, Why We Left Congress. And that's important for getting information right about why did they want to retire? Were they just tired of the institution? But there are a whole bunch of other questions about Congress that are hard to answer with data, but I think with a more robust, maybe qualitative approach, we could at least get that somewhat anecdotally, but consistently anecdotally.
I guess I'll just add a couple of things. One is on this sort of question that several folks have raised about the dynamics of the contemporary legislative process, and how, you know, even if committees work on bills, before they come to the floor, sometimes they get revised by leadership. Something that I've done some work on, I know others have done, that I think is really important, but that is hard to do in terms of getting the data, is when one piece of legislation becomes a vehicle for something else. I have an infinite number of transportation metaphors I could use here, but things like, you know, which passengers get on the bus when there's an omnibus moving, that sort of thing. Another thing that I would add on Michael's point about oversight is I do think that sort of measuring oversight is one of our thornier kind of data problems. Dan Diller from the Lugar Center is here. He'll be on our next panel. They've done a lot of really great work on this, and I'm sure he'll talk about that. Things like, you know, tracking letters that committees send to executive branch agencies. That is so that's one important output that we could track. It probably could be easier to track that than it is. At the same time, when we think about, you know, what it means to do oversight, some of the really important oversight work that's happening happens behind closed doors, and we're not ever going to, you know, there's a reason why we're not ever going to be able to measure that. And then the third thing I'll say, if I'm just talking about sort of my day-to-day experience working on vital stats, the biggest of all of the things that we track in vital stats, the data on congressional staff is honestly the most difficult for us to collect and work with. It's really important. I think it's one of our project's biggest value adds that we do track staff levels, the distribution of staff between Washington and the states and districts. Mufti was saying before about you know, how members are spending more time in their districts. That's also reflected in a greater share of members' staffs are in their states and districts than they used to be, than are in Washington. So that's kind of consistent with that. But that is honestly the biggest challenge that we have in all of the data that we track, is collecting that data and making sure that it's of high quality.
I never had to do this myself, but I've been around vital statistics for a long time myself, and I do remember many research assistants and interns spending a lot of time line by line working on congressional
Once
staff.
upon a time, as John is saying, it did involve, you know, physical copies of the statement of disbursements of the House, of the report of the Secretary of the Senate, and our army of very capable and wonderful interns. So that's, I mean, when you think about kind of what goes into the work that we put out there, and I'm sure this is true for you guys as well, it really is a collective effort. And so.
Great. We have more questions. I will add one more to the list. I hinted at it before, but committee data. We actually have, you know, some output data for committees, which is good, but, you know, knowing more about what goes on internally, even committee votes within the committee, information. I mean, we have some information about oversight and letters, but I think a fuller picture of committees is something that we don't have quite the data we need on. So, all right, we're going to go over here. All right, yeah. Dan Blair.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Blair with BPC. I appreciate the panelists' comments this morning, and I wanted to kind of get your views on another aspect of increasing congressional productivity, and that's the dirty word called earmarks. In the past, earmarks were kind of that grease that got the legislative gears moving, because you could get members on board or members to withhold objections if there was some horse trading done on the floor of, you know, this project for this, you know, this old-fashioned horse trading, this project for this vote, or this project is in this appropriations bill, so members didn't raise objections. Where do you see this going? Is that something that this new Congress can look at? Is it politically feasible, or is it just a bad idea to resurrect something that was probably a relic of the, you know, early part of this century, but really more the last century?
I'll be a big mouth first. The system became, as everybody knows, horribly abused in the early part of the 21st century. It really became sort of almost a barter system of government. And Mr. DeLay, who was at heart an appropriator and in real life an appropriator, found ways to use the appropriations process that I don't think the appropriations process ever understood. Having said that, I think there is an ability to use this and go back to it. A few years back, not very long ago, on miscellaneous tax stuff, we changed the system so that it goes to ITC and they have. I don't know why you couldn't do something like that with earmarks. Maybe use GAO, I don't know, maybe CRS, so that it would be known what they are, what they're doing. The other thing I have to say on earmarks is there's a lot of congressmen and women who know their districts and what they need in their districts better than anybody in the Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture, you name the department. And that's valuable information to have, but there has to be a control over it. So I would argue for a process somewhat like, I realize it would have to be somewhat different, but somewhat like the miscellaneous tariff solution to earmarks and putting them back in. A lot of my friends will hate me for saying that, but I think it's something worth doing, and I think individual members have a valid reason to be involved in some of these decisions that are made. And frankly, I think Congress ought to make more decisions, not fewer decisions, and take more of those away from the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Dave. And there were some proposals, I believe, in the last Congress where, because the definition of earmark is pretty draconian and pretty all-inclusive, so there were some proposals to allow earmarks, for example, for entities that work on health and safety of, citizens and, let's see, and just state entities or local governments. So, and I think those, you could have gotten a bipartisan support for those. And, Dave probably knows this better than anyone, but, there were decisions in the leadership not to go there because it was, the abuse was so bad and stands were taken. And so walking those stands back make it look like you're trying to go a slippery slope back to that abusive practice. So Steny Hoyer, when you talk in terms of this Congress, Steny Hoyer has been adamantly in favor of earmarks, and he has been out there publicly saying that. Kilmer said that his committee was recently appointed. Well, his vice chair is Tom Graves, and he is adamantly against earmarks. So, and he has said that. Lowy came out this week and said, look, everybody stop asking me, we're not doing earmarks. So I don't think we're going to see it. I don't think, but I absolutely agree with Dave. I think that there is a path forward, but I think it's going to take. Well, if you talk to some of the Democrats, they're like, well, the Republicans are the ones that put this draconian definition in place. They should be the ones to roll it back. And that seems a little ridiculous to me. But I think there is a path forward. I just don't think it's right now.
I think what Matti's describing, right, it's sort of a first mover problem is what the politics have come down to. You alluded to, right? Earmarks are a dirty word. They've become, they're used kind of to try to politically embarrass people or make it look like they're corrupt. And so, politically, who wants to make this decision to go first, right? Now, Democrats kind of have to say, like, okay, we're going to stick our neck out there for the good of everyone. But we don't know if Republicans are going to attack us, if Democrats start, the earmark process again, what's the reaction going to be? Is that going to be used against them? The kind of other thing, I guess, the bigger picture here, and again, this comes down to, Congress giving away its authority to the executive branch. Earmark is a term that basically, Washington came up with. It's congressionally directed spending. And to me, that sounds a lot like the power of the purse in Article 1 of the Constitution. I think, other than the fact that it'd be really administratively difficult and burdensome, Congress probably, if they decided, could spend the time to decide how almost every penny of any department's money was spent. If they wanted to pick every Department of Transportation project, they probably could outline that if they wanted to. They don't because it'd be really difficult. But I think the point that the pendulum has just swung too far in the wrong direction, and so now Congress has given up most of its power of the purse, except for really top-line decisions about how much money are going to go to certain types of programs.
One thing that I'll add on this, other than to just echo this separation of powers point that I think both Dave and Michael made, is to talk about the way that I think earmarks also can provide an important way for rank and file members to feel like they have agency in the legislative process. So, you know, Representative Kilmer was talking before about kind of the frustration that members from both sides of the aisle have been coming to him with now that he's the chair of this select committee. And I do think there's a degree to which in the current legislative process, your average member of Congress often feels like they have no opportunities to advocate for what they want for their specific districts. And I think finding a responsible way to bring back earmarks could help alleviate some of that kind of frustration that members feel about not being able to do things that really matter to their constituents.
Okay, we're going to go right here, and then we'll come back here.
I wonder if you all could share some thoughts about which of the factors or things that you've sought to study do you think resonate the most with members themselves as markers of progress? If it were up to the members themselves, what things would they most want to excel at? Is it customer service? Is it moving legislation or doing it in ways that don't happen often enough now, in a bipartisan way, for example? What would members most like to do? How would they?
It very much depends upon the member. You have members who really want to be an ombudsman, and use that as sort of constituent service. You have members who have an expertise in a certain area, and they get on the Commerce Committee and technology and that sort of, and just bury themselves in it. You have members, you name the subject. You have members who are. I worked for one who cared a lot about taxes, Jack Kemp. And Jack Kemp never served 1 second on the Ways and Means Committee. They never would have put him on there. But he had more impact on tax policy in the United States than I think almost every member of the Ways and Means Committee for a period of 40 years. And that's when we had some pretty powerful and important members of the Ways and Means and Finance Committee. This is what drove Jack. I mean, economics and tax policy drove him. You can like it or dislike it, but that's what drove him, and his mindset was for that. Now, yes, the office did the ombudsman things, and we worked, but it really depends upon the member because they all find where they're comfortable. The question is whether the institution is letting them be effective in where they're comfortable right now, and I think too many things in the institution are working against them being effective in that way. So I think it really depends. It's very much a personal view that a member takes, that they bring, that whatever their life experience is coming here will lead them one way or another.
One thing I might add is I think this is a common thread running through a number of our conversations here, and certainly when we try to get at it in our Healthy Congress Index. I think members are attracted to the idea of a good process, or one where they have some input. Now, we all know there's a balance between running the House, running one of the branches of the Congress, and getting things done and having member input. But boy, whether it's in committees or we talk about in the appropriations process or earmarks, a sense that there has to be some vehicle for members to express themselves a bit, to be in the mix. So that's a very broad thing, and we're going to have to figure out if the select committee does something on this, what the balance is. But that resonates not just backbench members, majority, minority, but even committee chairs and others who want to make sure that they're in the mix of the regular legislative process.
Yeah, to put a little bit of a fine point on it, relevance. What I hear, particularly members who have been in the minority for a number of years, they want to be relevant, and they get frustrated when the process doesn't allow them to be relevant.
Okay, we're going to go right here.
Good morning, and thank you.
Got a mic coming right at you.
Good morning, and thank you for the presentations. I'm Manny Vega. I'm an independent consultant. I have the feeling that no one has talked about the commitment of the Congress leadership. I'm talking about the House and the Senate to really propel change, to move away from this public perception that Congress is not able to deliver for the American public.
Well, I think this last Congress, you saw that commitment because that was the way Nancy Pelosi was able to get enough votes to become Speaker. She had to make these concessions. She took some of the problem solvers' recommendations and incorporated them into the rules package. She started this, select committee on the modernization of Congress. So You know, I mean, the leadership responds to its members, and I think we just saw that in January, where Pelosi was responding to the demands of her members that the process be more transparent, more open, more relevant to rank and file members.
No, I think that's the case, but the leadership would always like to be able to do that, and sometimes they're their own worst enemy, and sometimes they're herding the cats to go in a certain direction is difficult. I think what you have to watch out for is that it becomes leadership dominated in a very small room of a very few people, start making the decisions for everybody else, and that happens on both sides of the aisle. But it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. It was a very tricky series of decisions that Speaker Pelosi made in a very short period of time, all things considered, which put her in a position to be reelected as Speaker, which I suspect was probably going to be the likelihood anyway, but it wasn't easy. And there's a balancing act here where you have to literally know what every one of your members is thinking. You can't please everybody, but you have to know and you have to understand them. And that balancing act is not easy.
All right, on that note, we're going to end this panel, but move right to the next one. So thank the panelists, and David and Mufti are going to stay here. All right, we are not breaking, but we're gonna make a quick change because we have a number of institutions measuring Congress. We're going to be joined by three others on the stage, and David and Mufti are going to stay with us to make some comments. And Elsie is going to come up here. Great. Perfect. So let me start. I'm not going to reintroduce David Mufti, but I'm going to introduce our panelists here. Again, three more institutions that make a major contribution here in Washington by measuring Congress and helping us really understand what Congress is doing. I'll start at the end with Dr. Elsie Scott. She is the interim CEO of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She's a political scientist at Howard University and has been the director of the Ron Walters Center for Leadership. And I will just note for political scientists in the room, that is a great name in political science, who I've had some opportunity to deal with. So it is a honor having you here. Elsie is also works with the Joint Center in putting out their staff diversity index, or work that has gone on for the last couple Congresses, both in the House and Senate, and we'll talk about that. One more down the line here is Dan Diller, who's the Director of Policy at the Lugar Center. And the Lugar Center puts out a bipartisanship index, which measures the bipartisan quality of members of Congress and what they're doing. And he has previously been with Senator Lugar, both as legislative director and then as deputy staff director of the Foreign Relations Committee. Alan Weissman here is the co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. He's here with his partner in crime, who's in the audience, Craig Volden, who's the other co-director. He's a professor of political science and the chair of the political science department at Vanderbilt University, and the author of a number of political science and political economy articles and books as well. So I'm going to start at the end here with Elsie to say something about the staff diversity work that you've been doing with the Joint Center, and tell us what you're doing and how Congress is doing.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to be here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies reports looking at diversity in Congress. In 2015, the Joint Center released his first report on the Senate, looking at diversity. And then I was invited to be a part of the House study, which we released last fall. What we're looking at is how diverse are the staffs of members of the House of Representatives. We've watched diversity increase among members of Congress, but there was a lot of concern that the staff do not reflect the diversity of the country. And so what we've done is we've looked at the top 3 staffers in members' offices, in committee offices. And these 3 positions, sort of universally accepted, Chief of Staff, Communications Director, and Policy Director. Of course, we did get some pushback from some members' offices. Some people didn't like the definition. Some people, especially the ones that came out in the study that didn't have any diverse people at the top of their staff. And they argued that, well, my district director is a Latina, or my deputy chief of staff is a black person. But we had to cut off at some point. We're looking at the top 3, and most offices, these are the 3 most powerful positions in the office. We recognize that the district director is important at the district level, but we were also looking at people who can influence policy. And many times the district director is more of a constituent service director. And while that's important, and that may be the subject of another study, we were trying to get at the influence in the offices here in Washington. And one of the things that they found in the first study, in the Senate study, was that there was very little diversity. And we were defining diversity, looking at ethnic diversity, looking at African Americans, Latinas, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans. And how do we define that? We looked at first self-identification. We used Legistorm as our primary source of data. And where there were not, people were not identified by race, then what we did is we started calling offices, asking officers to identify the race. We looked for pictures. We did a very thorough investigation of trying to identify people so that we would make certain we didn't miss anybody who was a part of an ethnic group who was not identified. And so we think we were pretty accurate, because there was only a few people that we were not able to connect with at all, with their office, with them, to find out what was there, how did they racially identify. One of the sad things about our findings on the House side is the House has more diversity. They brag about it. But if you drill down, you looked at much of the diversity comes from the fact that you have diversity among the members of Congress. And the Congressional Black Caucus has the most diverse staff of any group of any of the caucuses that we looked at. And so if you didn't have those, well, it's 55 now, but it was 48, I think, in the last Congress. You didn't have those 48 African-American members of Congress, you really wouldn't have as much diversity. And so one of the concerns is that even when you look at, if you pull out the black and Hispanic, the ethnic groups out of the equation, you look at the white white Democrats, their diversity is not a lot different from the white Republicans. And so that was, I guess, one of the surprise findings. I don't know how much time do I have.
Go ahead. A little longer if you want.
Okay. And so we looked at caucuses, diversity. We looked at leadership offices. And we looked at interpersonal offices. And so, and then also in the back of the, and you can pull down the report off of the Joint Center's website, we listed, we looked at all the districts in the country that were at least 1/3 ethnic, 1/3 African American, Latino, Asian American, all lumped together. And we looked at whether those Congress people who represented those districts had any ethnic people, any persons of color, that's how we define it, any persons of color in those top 3 positions. And it was amazing that one of the people that came out on the top in terms of the percentage of Hispanics in his district and the fact that he had no persons of color on his top 3 position was Beto O'Rourke. And you had Steve Cohen, who represents like a 70% black district in Memphis. No persons of color on his top 3. So when our study was coming out, we had a lot of calls from offices trying to look at where their member was sitting and to argue with us on not releasing it, et cetera. But we think that as a result, we know that as a result after the Senate study, there was a lot of movement. In fact, Doug Jones, when he came to Congress, he appointed an African-American chief of staff. And so we've seen a lot of changes in the 116th Congress. Thank you.
Great. So, Dan, can you tell us about the Bipartisanship Index, the Lugar Center, both what you're trying to get at with it, and then how Congress is doing?
Sure. So, at the Lugar Center, we published a Bipartisan Index. This is a measure that looks at primarily sponsorships and co-sponsorships. And we use data going back to 1993, so we cover 13 Congresses. And what we're trying to measure is how members interact with members of the other party, particularly at bill introduction. When a member introduces a bill or seeks to address a problem, they can choose either to introduce a message bill that will have no support from the other party, or they can choose to seek out a partner with the other party, integrate some broad thinking into the bill, construct it in a way where it has the best chance to pass, and try to get something done. So specifically, what we're measuring is the frequency with which a member of Congress introduces a bill that's co-sponsored by a member of the other party, and the frequency with which each member co-sponsors bills that are introduced by the other party. The results that we have for each Congress are a comparison with a 20-year baseline that runs from 1993 to 2013, in which you have basically Republican and Democrat controlled each controlled 5 of those 10 Congresses. And so a member is measured according to how well they do compared to the average of a member in their circumstances during that baseline period. And so over time, what we found was that scores beginning really in the 106th Congress at the turn of the century peaked and then began to decline with some variation until the 112th Congress, 2011, 2012, when scores in both the House and the Senate bottomed out. And then there have been some modest improvements over the last couple of Congresses, but still, scores are well below the baseline. We are just about to come out in probably 2 weeks, I think maybe March 19th, with our final scores for the 115th Congress. But we're able to look in the first year to understand what was happening in 2017. And the results were fascinating and unexpected in some respects, especially in the Senate. The House has been less dynamic with changes occurring relatively slowly. Both Democrats and Republicans are below average, below the baseline. But in the Senate, we see what we believe is a response to the president, and that is that Republican Senate scores have skyrocketed on our scale, while Democrat scores have declined. And this comes in a historical context where Democrat scores have exceeded Republican scores by a small amount. Democrats actually led Republicans in 7 of the 13 Congresses that we've studied. And we've tried to understand why Republican Senate scores have improved so much. In a sense, they are co-sponsoring many more Democrat-sponsored bills than they have in the past. And there's a number of theories that we've thought through, but they're just theories. But our belief is that Republican senators see electoral risk both from the Trump base in a primary, and this is not news to anyone, but also in the general election because of the president's unpopularity with, in general voter surveys, and they're, in a sense, hedging their bets. The belief is, as long as they support the president in his most high-profile initiatives, building the wall, and as long as they don't attack him in ways that will engender a response from the base or from the president himself, that's all that's needed to kind of hold the base. In the meantime, there's this, I don't want to say subterranean, but unnoticed activity where they are cooperating much more frequently with Democrat senators at bill introduction. So it's a fascinating dynamic. And it's so strong that for the first time since the 112th Congress, the overall Senate score may be pulled above 0, meaning that the 115th Congress would actually score better than the average Congress during the baseline period.
So, Alan, same question. What are you doing? You're measuring legislative effectiveness, and how is Congress doing on that realm?
Sure. Thanks a lot. Well, thanks so much for having me here. The Center for Effective Law, you who aren't familiar with it, is a joint research initiative that is organized between Vanderbilt University and the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, and has been in existence since September 2017 with the support of both of our institutions and the generous support of the Madison Initiative, the Hewlett Foundation, as well as the Democracy Fund. Our broad mission essentially is to generate, or is to advance the generation, communication, and use of new knowledge about the individual effectiveness of lawmakers as well as legislative institutions and Congress as a whole. And one major part of our mission is essentially to develop what we refer to as legislative effectiveness scores, which is a summary metric of how successful an individual member of the U.S. House or U.S. Senate is at moving his or her legislative agenda items. And by that we mean the bills that he or she sponsors through the entire legislative process from perhaps, well, definitely introduction up until perhaps being signed into law by the president, where individual bills are upgraded or downgraded based on substantive significance. And to do this, I mean, essentially we've ripped down all of the data from congress.gov from the 93rd Congress to the 115th. So that's basically 1973 up until 2018 for those of us that don't speak Congressese. And essentially, drawing on all this data, we're able to come up with an objective indicator of how successful individuals, members of the House and Senate, are moving these bills through the process. The broad research and outreach of the focus of the center is organized largely into 3 themes. One is identification, so trying to understand what it might be about people's past career paths, their training, what they were like prior to coming into the chamber that might predict their legislative success. Cultivation, that being upon being elected to House and Senate, what strategies might they employ, or how might the party leaders either facilitate opportunities for them or perhaps inhibit opportunities for them to become effective lawmakers. And then the third theme is that of accountability. To what degree do individual voters even think about this concept of lawmaking effectiveness? If they're informed about it, does this influence their perceptions about their lawmakers and the like? So thinking about those 3 themes, I think the theme that's most relevant to what we're talking about today is that of cultivation. Essentially, what happens when people are in the chamber, either by their own agency or perhaps because of different institutional changes that have happened over the last 15 to 20 years in particular, that might either contribute to or detract from their effectiveness as lawmakers. And I think there's 3 main points that I think are particularly relevant to today's discussion. First, building on some of the sentiments from the first panel as well as the points that were raised by Representative Kilmer, our findings would suggest that there is a profound relationship between staffing decisions and the individual effectiveness of lawmakers, but perhaps not in the way that many people might appreciate. In contrast to the ways in which various policy reforms have been advocated for, it's not clear that just essentially throwing more money at the problem is going to help here. And by that I mean just giving an individual member of Congress the opportunity to hire 2, 3, 4 more staff people, that in and of itself might not really matter. And I say that because our findings would suggest there's no clear relationship between the number of one's legislative staff, or pardon me, the number of one's personal staff that's devoted to legislative policy matters and their ability to move their legislative policies through the entire process. What we did find, however, is there's a very strong relationship between the tenure on the Hill or the overall experience of some of the staff and one's individual effectiveness. But even in that way, or the relationship we uncovered wasn't entirely clear. And more specifically, for really junior members of the House, and by that I mean people in their freshman or sophomore terms, having individual staff members with just even a little bit more experience than, say, someone that's pulled directly from a campaign, for example, is really helpful to them. After the sophomore term, however, I mean, small increases in the level of staff experience doesn't make that much of a difference. What we did find, however, is the super staffers that are out there. Some of us know them personally. These people who have been on the Hill for 10, 15, 20 years. Having individuals like that in your office makes a huge difference in terms of your ability to move your legislative program forward. But as we know, and this is consistent with some of the points that were raised in the earlier panels, holding on to these type of staff on the Hills or cultivating this degree of staff expertise is becoming increasingly challenging, especially if we think about the staff cutbacks that have happened over the last 20 years. So the extent to which we might want to think about institutional changes that could perhaps facilitate differences in the incentive structure to cultivate staff expertise and hold on to more senior staff that could clearly contribute to lawmakers' success. Another point that's relevant to this discussion is really the ways in which the House has chosen to structure its own rules, and more specifically, the ways in which they've decided to deal with the tenure of committee chairs. So one clear finding that emerges from our research is that, as you'd hope, and it would be sensible, people generally become better at lawmaking across time. The longer they're in Congress, the more successful they are at moving their agenda further and further to the legislative process. And this is particularly true of committee chairs. But the one thing that also emerges from our data very naturally is the imposition of committee term limits starting with the 104th Congress led to a pretty significant overall decrease in the scope and expertise and success of those who occupy these chair positions. And in the bluntest sense, many committee chairs in our data set, once they got past their third term, and by that I mean those who were serving the Congress before the 104th Congress, once they got past that third term as committee chair, that's where we really see them take off in terms of their ability to navigate the legislative programs, in terms of distinguishing themselves compared to the average member of their party. But as we all know, for all intents and purposes, no one really serves past the third term as committee chair at this point. And what we've seen in our data is that even though committee chairs are definitely more successful at navigating their programs than non-committee chairs, their overall ability to move things through the process compared to those who had perhaps served as committee chairs for 4, 5, 6, 7 terms, there's a stark difference that's really difficult to recover with any other institutional privileges. And the third point that I'd like to raise, which speaks directly to this point about bipartisanship, is what could individual members of the House and Senate perhaps do to advance their own agendas? Our research would also suggest that those who engage in more broader patterns of bipartisan co-sponsorship, both seeking out opportunities to engage in bipartisan co-sponsorship as well as attracting increasing numbers of bipartisan co-sponsors in their own initiatives, tend to be more successful at advancing the legislative programs than those who are essentially monopartisan or really not even reaching out and being entrepreneurial in the co-sponsorship process. So I guess to some degree we're saying, contrary to potential fears or arguments that bipartisanship is dead, there's actually reasons to believe, similar to what our co-author Laurel Harbridge Young at Northwestern would say, that bipartisanship is actually alive and well at a limited degree, and to some points it actually ties to lawmaking effectiveness in ways that some people might be optimistic about.
Great, and with a tip to our hat to your prior service, what I take from that is our super staffers have to return to the Hill here. Is that? But I'd like to hear from them. So if you want to start with Dia again, we certainly.
I'll start with an anecdote.
Yep.
My tenure on the Hill was 76 to 2010. And during most of my tenure, folks left the Hill, but they left when they were really done. They had accomplished a lot of legislation. They were in very senior positions. They'd they'd done that, and then they left. I can't tell you how many coffees I have now on a monthly basis, numerous coffees with young staff. So what do I need to do to get downtown? What committee should I be on? What issues should I be working on? It's staff on the Hill, particularly in a personal office, has become a check the box to some larger career. And that has just kind of been just sort of really sad for me to see that over the years. And I just want to say with respect to the diversity study, so again, we always, Dave and I, new members come in and they ask for our advice, and so many members have come to me, and I think that your study has been so powerful in this way when you say it's actually made a difference, and they said, look, I'm looking for these candidates, make sure you bring me diversity in the candidates. And I think that that's really a result from your study, and I think it's had an impact downtown as well. I think people are we're looking at that report, I know it's circulated downtown, and people are like, okay, everybody's paying attention to this now. We have to look inside as well. So thank you for that.
Not very often I sit and listen and find out that being old is good. One of the things, as you look, and I'll go back to not an anecdote of mine, but a historical situation. And there was a senator from New York named James Buckley, who served from 70 to 76, and actually won by accident because there was a three-way election. There was, in New York, for people who know it, they have an array of parties you can affiliate with on the ballot, and he was on the conservative ballot, and however it worked out, he won. Pat Moynihan, Senator Moynihan defeated him in the 1976 election. But if you go look at James Buckley's staff, the number of staff people who worked for Jim Buckley and went on to be senior legislative staff, senior people in administrations, it's shocking. Almost everybody in that staff ended up running something, being a deputy secretary, an assistant secretary, being a secretary of this, that, or department, or running operations in the Senate, running operations in the House. And he had clearly, I don't know what it was about Jim Buckley. He was obviously a smart man. Those people who have had the advantage of meeting him, which I was lucky enough to do on one or two occasions, he's maybe the most decent man I know in public life. He's just a thoroughly decent man. Once again, agree or disagree with him philosophically, but this is a thoroughly decent man. But there are people who attract that. We have gotten to a point, though, I think, where it really is a checking the box sort of a thing. And it takes time as you build. When I went to work for Dan Coates, after the '88 election, he was appointed senator from Indiana when Dan Quayle became vice president because of the election. And my wife and I had known Dan and Marcia for 12 years. My wife worked for Quayle when he was elected to the House. Dan Coates was Quayle's district representative. My wife, because of the situation in the office, ended up being the one who did most of the work back and forth to the district. So we'd known them. And then when Dan Quayle ran for the Senate, Dan Coates ran for the House and got Quayle's seat, so we'd known him forever. And what he wanted to do, and the priority thought in mind was, I've got 2 elections in 4 years. I want to get elected to this job. And just the way the state of Indiana's rules run, he had to run for election in '90 and run for election in '92. And so he wanted a staff put together that could make him a legislative senator as quickly as possible, so that he was a part of the process. And frankly, the model, as we looked at it, at that time was Ted Stevens, who had been an appointed senator from Alaska when he first became a senator. And if you watch what Stevens did, he acted like he'd been elected a senator and acted like he should be involved in every decision that was made on Alaska or anything else. He acted like he was part of the process right away. No learning curve for Ted Stevens. And that was the model we adopted. You look at it, and staff people either fit into the mold of what the member wants to be. Going back to the earlier question, so what are our different members? And they look for people who fulfill those needs. The final thing I'll say is, if you look at over the past, since we came in the mid-'70s, the majority of staff was in the Washington office. And it was really that time after the '74 election it started to change, and it's changed further and further and further. After the '94 elections, Republicans went even further, but there were times in there where more and more of the staff is now in the district office. Fine, that's the way the system runs right now, but it has meant that a lot of the legislative responsibilities, where you used to have maybe 3 or 4 people doing legislative work in a House office, you may have 2 now. It has increased the amount of work for the staff here in Washington who are doing the legislative things with a smaller number of people. That's just a fact. It's neither here nor there. It's not a quality judgment. They're great people of great quality. But it is a fact that 2 people can't do as much work as 4 people can. that's life. Time is the one thing we can't expand, folks. So you know, you had 48 hours as opposed to 96 hours. There's just differences in what people can do when you have more of them. But it really very much reflects what a member is, what a member wants to be, how they want to see themselves as a part of their job as a House member, their job as a senator.
So we started, I think, appropriately of the role of staff. So maybe I can come back to some of our measurers over here. And Elsie asked, obviously you're looking at expanding the pool of diverse staff, but have you also looked at the retention of staff already on the Hill, diverse staff on the Hill, and making sure that they have a chance to get that sort of experience? And I guess the question maybe for Alan and Dan is a little bit more about committee work. Again, we talked about that earlier, but staffers, you know, it was once said, you know, that the House is run by 20-somethings, the Senate is run by 30-somethings, and committee staffers are 40-somethings. It's not totally true anymore, but there's a logic to this. What do you find about staff on committees and personal offices, or what kind of experience that is really bringing something to the governing process? So,
okay, the Joint Center studies have not looked at the tenure of staffers. From where I sit now as interim president of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, we have a fellowship program and an internship program which were designed to serve as avenues, pipeline, to try to increase the number of African Americans on the Hill. And the fellowship program, the young people that come in that program usually have advanced degrees. They want to work in the professional staff positions on the committee or in the House. And one of the things of watching the progression of people through that program, because I was president of the Congressional Black Caucus before 6 years earlier, I've watched the progression of the people coming through that program. And you do have some that are interested in going to the Hill and staying on the Hill, but I think it's fewer than it used to be. But you still, you know, you look at Elijah Cummings, Chief of Staff, has been there a long time. Clyburn's, well, he's no longer Chief of Staff, he's now in the leadership office, Yebby. And a lot of people have tried to get Yebby to go downtown. But, you know, he has an interest in legislation, and a lot of people seem to not value people that want to stay on the Hill. A lot of the young people, they don't feel like that's success. Success is getting with a lobbying group or running for office yourself. And so I think that's something we need to look at, is that what are the desires of young people that's coming to the Hill, and how long do they stay there, and the ones who stay there, why do they stay? I'd like to, that's an opportunity for another study. My director of research is over there.
The previous panel talked somewhat about oversight and how Congress is able to compete with the executive branch, and you know, in terms of staffing on committees, you know, I tell the anecdote coming from the Foreign Relations Committee that, you know, in the United States Congress, when we were there really were only 4 staffers whose exclusive role was to be concerned with East Asia. You know, 2 staffers on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, 1 Democrat, one Republican, and 2 similar on the House side. And those 4 staffers didn't comprise a unit. You know, usually they were working against each other, either Senate against the House or Democrat against Republican. And they talked and they communicated, and there was, you know, there was bipartisan activity, but they weren't, you know, they weren't dividing in their labor. They were each dealing with this region. And the reason this is so illustrative is it's East Asia. You know, you have 22, 23, 24 countries, everything from Western China to Hawaii, everything from Japan to Australia. 2 billion people, you know, problems as diverse as, you know, nukes in North Korea, or, you know, the tsunami disaster in you know, the Indian Ocean, you know, human rights, hunger issues, everything you can imagine. And you think of all the people in the executive branch, in the State Department and the Defense Department, other agencies, who are solely focused on East Asia, the limits of congressional oversight, kind of become apparent, and so adding staffers may or may not have effect on legislation. Alan's better at making that judgment, but it almost certainly has effects on oversight and the ability of Congress to just deal with the massive amounts of activities and expertise in the executive branch. And this is not unique to foreign policy. It plays out in every agency.
And just to flesh out our analysis a little bit further, we don't look at committee staff at all. We're looking entirely at personal staff. But related to these points, as well as related to the point that was just raised, one thing we do find is that in our data, and the data we're looking at is basically drawn from 1994 up until 2013, it's definitely the case that committee chairs have a disproportionate amount of more senior staff on their personal staffs compared to non-committee chairs. Especially more recent Congresses, we are seeing this world, and this is consistent with what you were describing, that the overwhelming majority of members on the House, in the House, have really, really junior staffs, and then there's a very big gap between this really low end of staff experience, and then it jumps quite a bit to the super staffers or people that are pretty close, and most of the super staffers have found themselves moving into the personal staffs of committee chairs. So the extent to which those committee chairs, are likely double dipping in various ways for advancing the legislative program, that at least suggests that they're getting some of the expertise that's been cultivated over a long career.
Can I just say one other thing that's really important to look at on this, not just so much on tenure, but to the extent that political ideology seeps down to the staff, because members have to have their sort of their public persona, which can be very ideological. But if that seeps down to the staff, it's really hard to get stuff done. If it doesn't seep down to the staff, you can actually find both sides of the aisle on the staff level working really closely on some of these things that that end up being bipartisan.
So maybe we can turn a little bit, ask you and Dave to reflect about what makes effective legislators. We have some interesting data. What's your experience, and what would you tell us about the way Congress has changed over time in that respect?
I think what makes effective legislators are people who stick with an idea over a period of time or a series of ideas. Sometimes you don't get something done in a Congress or even two Congresses. It takes more time than that. There are also people who are looking to find people to convince to their side. I mentioned Jack Kemp before. Jack was a proselytizer. I mean, I had the experience of walking down the hallways, and it was always more clear in the Rayburn building than any other. I'd see congressmen turn, and I knew sort of where they were going because what was happening. Turn off and go another hallway because they just didn't want to talk to Jack again. They just didn't need it anymore. And not that they didn't like him. They'd heard it. They'd heard the gospel. That was it. But he was somebody who over time, and it is people who have an interest that they're willing to build and develop and willing to adjust so that they may not get every piece of it, but the thrust of what they want to accomplish is what they want to protect. And what they have to do to maneuver to work with people on both sides of the aisle and their caucuses, as caucuses stretch from more liberal to more conservative members in both of the caucuses, how they would adjust to work with them and who the key people on committees were. They were always alert as to what they wanted to do and were willing to make those adjustments, keeping, once again, the core of what they wanted to accomplish. And I thought, over time, I think you find those people, and they're just doggedly determined. It takes a lot. It's hard to pass laws. It's supposed to be hard to pass laws. Not impossible, but hard. And these are people who kept with it. So Senator Kennedy, I mean, would introduce an idea, and 10 years later, the legislation may pass. And there was, not that he spent every day of that 10 years working on that, but never lost track, never lost the thread. The thread always continued.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to quote our beloved John Dingell, you know, you write the substance, I'll write the procedure, and I'll win every time. And that doesn't mean that you have to memorize the rules book, but you have to know how to get things done. You have to know how to get things done. And he was a master at that, and his staff was a master at that. And then it's relationships. And, you know, Tim Kaine, who just won his seat, you know, he was going around the state talking about all these great things that he had done. I'm not sure he comes up into any of these statistics because I don't think he's had a bill pass. He has been just expert at building these relationships and getting on these vehicles, you know, the vehicles that are moving, the vehicles, that he's just an expert at it. And so he would tick through all of his accomplishments. None of them were his bills. They were all provisions that he's had inserted because he knew the process and he had the relationships.
So we're going to open it up to the audience here, make sure we have our microphones here. And I know I missed Don Wolfensberger in the last round, so I'm going to go to Don first here. If we can get the microphone to him, it's coming behind you. I've identified you already.
Yeah, I believe Alan mentioned in passing term limits and the fact that when he had the 3-term limit on committee chairmen, they were just starting to get up to speed, and that sort of took their legs out from under them as far as future accomplishments. But one of the things that Nancy Pelosi did in December to the last group that she was pitching to get enough votes to win on the floor was to promise that she would only serve one more term after this if she got a 2/3 vote or something. But the idea of a 3-term limit on leadership, the other 2 leaders didn't go along with that, either Steny Hoyer or Clyburn. But it was interesting that she did this in that when she took over as Speaker in 2007, she left the term limits in the rules for committee chairmen. And these Democrats were looking around saying, why did she do that? She lifted it then the next Congress, but she wanted to make sure that the chairman knew who they were accountable to. But I'm just wondering, the Democrats were supposed to debate this, I think, in their caucus this past month. I don't know that it came up. I didn't read anything about it. But she wants to resurrect this idea, even though she, I think, will be outvoted in the caucus. But I'm just wondering what some of our panelists think about term limits. I think the Republicans still have them in their conference rules, as I recall.
Well, I think it'd be good to get Elsie really to speak to this because I think that, you know, I think the CBC has been a stalwart in kind of keeping that rule from, in one, repealing it, and 2, and keeping it out again. And you know, I have my own opinions about it, but it doesn't really matter what I think about it. I think I agree with what Alan's stats have shown, but I think it's really important, I think, to get Elsie's view on where that is.
Well, it seems that one of the reasons why the CBC has fought the seniority rule is because many of them have been in Congress many years, and they've finally worked their way up to become chair of committees. And so they see this as we have worked for this, and we've waited on this, we've stayed in Congress, and now it's our time. And so I think that's it in a nutshell, is that they have, you know, you now have 5 members of the CBC that are chairs of full committees, and I don't even have the number of all the subcommittee chairs, but this is only the second time that it's happened. In 2007 it happened. You had 5 CBC members that were chairs of subcommittees, and so now they've waited since then because some of them stumbled along the way, and now they're back in those positions. I think as you see more young people come into the CBC, you may see the position change.
Any other thoughts on term limit? Dave, you expressed, I think both of you expressed some worries about experience. Do you see a difference between the House and the Senate on this? I mean, Senate also has term limit rules for chair, but the nature of the Senate often is that senior members have some options to go be another chairman of another committee, use that experience. I think the worry is in the House that you would shut a lot of people out.
An anecdote of when the Republicans in the Senate decided to put limitations on leadership was after the '94 elections in '95. And the discussion was we ought to limit them all to 6 years. But then somebody stood up and said, wait a minute. Bob Dole's running for president, and we want him to be president because he's a good senator like all of us. We want him to get the nomination to be president. Do we really want to say we want to limit Bob Dole when he's running for president? So the decision as to whether they would apply it to the Republican leader in the Senate, which they do not, was based on the fact that Bob Dole was going to be running for president, and most of his colleagues in the Senate were supportive of him, not all, but most of them were, and didn't want to say anything or do anything that would allow people to say, well, you mean they think Bob Dole ought to be thrown out as leader? How can they elect him president? That was almost in toto the decision for dividing between everybody else in the leadership having 6-year terms and the leader having unlimited terms.
I mean, the one final point I raised about committee chair term limits is there's the direct effect that we demonstrate in our research that after, I mean, essentially once the clock hits midnight at the end of your 3rd term, there's a big drop off with the new person coming in. But it's also useful to think about what the indirect effects are, and that being, from a member's perspective, if you're toiling away in the House, as you note, I mean, it's hard. I mean, under your best days, you have a 4% chance of a bill becoming law. I mean, that's really exciting. So as you're toiling away on a day-by-day basis, you also have to figure out which issues do you want to engage with, how do you want to cultivate your portfolio of bills and agenda items. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm pretty senior, but realistically the best thing I could hope for, especially if you're from a relatively safe district, the best thing I could hope for is I become a committee chair for 6 years, and then I need to kind of figure out what else I want to do. That's most likely going to be affecting some of the ways in which you structure your activities and which issues you really decide to become an expert on. I mean, some of the most effective committee chairs in the House, thinking back to the 70s and 80s, these are people that really made a career focusing on one particular issue. These people were the policy wonks of the House, and they had a strong vested interest to do so because upon moving into positions of leadership in the committee, as long as they didn't get knocked out, there's reasons to believe they'd be running the show for quite a long time. And if you change the incentive structure, which follows from these changes in the institutions, you have to ask yourself what's happened to these relatively junior members of the House as to decide how, if at all, they're going to specialize.
Not to get too into the weeds or create another research project, but do you think, given the Senate, you often can find chairs moving over to other committees and being chairs, did you find that just being a chairman of any committee or being a chair for a while leads to effectiveness, or is it the subject matter of being on that same committee and chair that really jumps you up?
Right. So the general patterns of the House carry over to the Senate, in the sense things that matter in the House also matter in the Senate with regards to committee chairs or subcommittee chairs. But I would say the effects or the magnitude of the effects are a lot smaller in the Senate. The Senate, I mean, the distribution of powers, I mean, as we expect, and given everything we know about it, distribution of power is still a bit more even spread, even in these current times, than what we see in the House. So being a committee chair is still valuable in the Senate, but it's not nearly as valuable in comparison to the House. And the subcommittee chair, if you're in the majority party in contemporary times, you'd be really hard pressed to find which members don't have a subcommittee chair. I mean, there are some, but not many. So.
Great. Okay, we'll open it up for more questions right here, and microphone's just coming to you.
Thank you. So I want to talk about the evolution of congressional caucuses. I've been working on this for 10 years since I did my dissertation at University of Michigan. And some of my research, I find that they're analogous to lobby groups. They kind of do the work of lobbyists internally. And so you spoke earlier on the other panel about the human connection and aspect of engagement. So I want to ask your interest about the formalization of caucuses and in terms of its influence on, and accountability, by the way, because we know that there's just a lack of record keeping. I had to do all empirical primary data work to get all this data, but it's fascinating because I have data that shows it supports the rate of co-sponsorships on bills, but no member's ever going to tell you they co-sponsored a bill because their friend did it. But it's important because there's a lot of engagement. It's voluntary, and so it signals something about these members' willingness to work beyond committee if they didn't get the relevant, committee chairmanship. But it also gives them an opportunity to show they represent these issues. And you can go to any member's website, and they have a list, and I tell my students all the time, look at these 500 caucuses that all these members are on. There's no possible way they could be equally active on all, but yet they still matter. So my question is twofold. Do you see the formalization of caucuses or the evolution as something that's positive for the influence of caucus making? And then we know in the 90s, well, there's never really been franking privileges, but the appropriations for budget for caucuses was done away with Gingrich. And so do you think that, you know, there is a reason for that. Accountability, formalization, making it more difficult to create a caucus. Do you see these things as, is there any kind of viability there for the influence of caucuses on policy?
Let me handle the mid-90s question first, because it's all about power. Speaker Gingrich did not want a rump group, which if you look at Speaker Gingrich's history, he started rump groups and used rump groups, but he didn't want the Republican Study Committee to exist. It was really very simple, because that was going to be a group that he knew was going to be to the right of him and was going to be criticizing him, and he really didn't want criticism. And frankly, so he just got rid of everybody. And that was the easiest way to do it, is just wipe them all out. And that's what he did. Over time, I mean, not too many years, I mean, you probably know the dates better than I do. After that, though, it started back up in the economy. And it's really, to my way of thinking, to go to the first part of your question, is this is very important for House members. You have 1 or 2 committee assignments, and it may be where you have real expertise, and over time they may change. I mean, everybody wants to get on Ways and Means, or they want to get on Appropriations, or they want to get on Commerce, or handful of those. But before that time, they also want to show their constituents and have an ability to participate. Now, look at the House phone book and look at the Senate phone book. In the House phone book, there's what, 25, 30 pages, 35 pages of caucuses. In the Senate phone book, I don't think it completes 1 page. They just don't need to. They just don't need to. But the House, you are effective insofar as you can be a part of a group. And it's one of the reasons why peer pressure is much less effective in the House than it is in the Senate. In the Senate, you've got 100 senators, all to some degree atomized individual dukes of their own little duchies. In the House, you got 15 or 20 people you work with, and you really don't care what the outside pressure is. In addition, in the House, if you have 15 or 20, you can be the difference between winning and losing a vote. Whereas if you're one, you don't mean very much in the House. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of House votes that are decided by 1 vote. There's quite a few decided by 12 or 15 votes. In the Senate, once again, a senator has the power, because of the rules in the Senate, to involve themselves, to inject themselves, to make the institution at least listen to them, if nothing else. But in the House, if you've got 15, 20 in your group, and whether it's the caucus or whether it's a freedom caucus or whatever one wants to use as an example, you suddenly have a lot of power. And the closer you get to a critical vote, the more power you have if you've got a group that's pretty well knit. And that can be a caucus, it can be individual groups, and that's what means and if you and the 20 people or your buddies in this group just don't care. I mean, you want to get something, you want to do something, but the pressure from the outside really doesn't have the effect on you. You have empowered yourself by having a group. And I think the way the House runs is what requires that, or makes you more effective to have a group.
All right, we're going to go back here.
Hi. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about socioeconomic diversity on the Hill. We talked a lot about racial and ethnic diversity, but I think that socioeconomic diversity is something that's really important to look at.
Do we measure there? I was going to say, we may have Molly Reynolds sitting in the audience who knows some of that in vital statistics. You don't do that? Okay.
We only track staffers. We don't track
right.
Staff salaries.
Once again, staff salaries tend to have very much to do with the member. Senator Grassley, when he was in the House, I haven't tracked it or had reason to look at it in the Senate, but when he was in the House, he paid Iowa salaries. In case you haven't looked, it's a lot cheaper to live in Iowa than it is to live in Washington, D.C. But he knew those salaries would be run on the front page of every newspaper when the clerk's report came out. And he didn't want some Iowa farmer who was scratching to get it done, seeing that some young kid at 27 years of age was making 2.5 times what he was making. He had a lot of good people, but you tended to see Grassley people sort of roll through Grassley, but that was just his mindset. And so there's differences in how members do that, and some of them want to have a more level set, and there's some, and over time, people who stay a long time. I had one rule when I worked on Capitol Hill, is that I would leave the moment I couldn't do something for my family. For example, if I couldn't send my kids to college, I told myself I'd leave. Well, I luckily never got to that point. The things worked out that I didn't have to. But that's a fair thing to say. It is fair to say, I want to stay here as long as I can, but my family deserves something too. And so there's a vast array of things that come into making that decision, from the members and how they want to see themselves portrayed, to the individuals and their families, to what their needs may be. I started with the princely sum of $12,000 a year. And even in the mid-'70s, that wasn't a lot of money in Washington, D.C. More than it is now, but it wasn't a lot then. You start at the bottom, and there ought to be, if you're good and successful and help your member and are able to be a good staff person, one would hope that one can rise in that. And I think keeping good people on the Hill, they have to see that there's an opportunity to improve their situation. And part of that is financial. It's not all financial, but part of it's financial.
Yeah, I'm a very strong believer that, the ceiling should be raised. And the Problem Solvers Caucus actually did address this, that, sort of tying it to, civil service, or I don't know, they had some formula for staff salaries, but it is a problem. It is a problem. It's not sustainable, in my view.
All right, we have time for one last question.
Thank you very much. First of all, Dr. Scott, the research that you had talked about in terms of diversity was really interesting, and also one thing that I picked up, not that you spoke today, but that was in the report previously, was even some of the differences in home state senators, where Senator Feinstein and Senator Harris, for example, had a huge difference in terms of the general diversity of their staff, even though they're from the same state. But one thing that I wanted to pick up on was the conversation around legislative effectiveness. Because the conversation that we had here seemed like it was narrow in certain ways. Effectiveness is moving your bills, but it's also stopping bills you don't like. It's Muftiya talked about this a little bit in terms of inserting provisions. It's how you go and sort of work your way through the legislative process. But in with Dr. Weissman's the study that you're doing, it seems to really look at sponsorship and co-sponsorship of legislation, which although is useful because it has it's coming from the Congress.gov or primarily formerly Thomas data, it doesn't seem to measure a lot of these other things, right? Can you stop things? Can you move where the center of the debate is? Can you change the nature of the conversations that are taking place? And I'm hoping that maybe the panel can shed a little bit of light on what might be other measures of legislative effectiveness besides just counting up how many bills have your name on it that sort of make it past the finish line. I'd be really interested in that as well.
Start. Sure. Maybe that was partly for Dan, too.
Yeah. So first of all, I completely agree with you in the sense that we're focusing on a very specific definition of lawmaking effectiveness, and that being the proven ability of an individual member of the House and Senate to move his or her agenda items through different stages in the process. Our metric is a little more granular than just thinking about overall hit rates, for example, because we're trying to take into account these intermediate steps of success or lack thereof. But you're right, it's still very member-centered. There's a lot of ways in which we think about expanding beyond this to touch on many of the points that have been raised. Among the things we're exploring right now, or among the issues we're trying to explore right now, is the intactness of the legislative language in the sense of how much does it vary from the time it's introduced to the time it ultimately culminates in law or where it dies off in the process. We have a postdoc, Kelsey Shobe, who's going to be starting at the University of South Carolina, who's working on us precisely with this to make sure that we're going beyond just essentially what the bill counts are. But you're right, it's very much the case. The extent to which we might think about people being really successful at engaging in dilatory motions, for lack of a better phrase, we are not accounting for this at the moment, but what we are doing is coming up with what is unambiguously a transparent and objective indicator that does provide us the summary metric of how good, well, I want to say good, successful people are in moving their own agendas forward. But there are a variety of other aspects of this that I think Craig and I and others would agree are very important to measure and account for in this regard. But I would be very interested in everyone's perspective on other things they think would be constructive to both measure, if not by us, by other people.
Did you want to, Dan?
Yeah. This isn't what I do at the Lugar Center, but I had the opportunity recently to write a small book in relation to my boss, Senator Richard Lugar, and his 36-year career, because his archives are opening at Indiana University in about 3 weeks, and this book's accompanying that. And as part of this exercise, we identified 58 accomplishments, and there were more than that, but that sort of made this book. And we found, and I may share this with you because it's a little case study, but we found 2 of them had to do with dilatory tactics. And one was, he was a leader of the labor law reform filibuster in the 1980s. And another, he objected to the 1995-1996 block granting of the school lunch program, and sort of refused to sign the conference report despite Republican pressure. But of the other 56 things, not all were legislative. There were things that he did in the state and things that he did through oversight, but probably 2/3, 3/4 of it was legislative. And so I think if you look at legislative effectiveness, you are getting to most of it. You get if you're examining what bills are introduced, how those move through the process, what became law. But there are some things that any member, if you reflect on their years, you'll find accomplishments that don't fit into legislative categories.
So I'm going to thank all of the panels, this panel and the prior ones, and the audience. We know that you are all people who care about the institution of Congress very much. Some of what needs to be done to move things forward is to really know how Congress is doing, to push it to be better, to hold it accountable. And I think some of the institutions here are doing that. And this conversation where we get to share how Congress is doing from a variety of perspectives has been very helpful to that. Also very helpful to think about whether the measures of Congress really are getting at the real phenomena, and know that the people who've been working and know this institution very well from a practical standpoint can be part of that conversation. So thank you all for coming, and we're closed.
Foundation.